Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today. I still didn't have enough to talk about David George and the Black Loyalists, so today I have a very special guest from Shelburne, Nova Scotia, who's going to be helping me with this. And it's none other than Reverend Ed Trevors. So, Reverend, please tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
I am Ed Trevors. I'm an Anglican priest. I serve in the beautiful town of Shelburne, Nova Scotia, in the amazing parish of Christ Church, Shelburne. We are seated on the ancestral and the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq people, and we are one of the locations that was settled by the Loyalists after the Revolutionary War in the United States, and we had a high population of Black Loyalists who arrived here as well.
And that's exactly what we're going
You
to
can
talk about today.
I'm supposed to tell you about my channel.
Yeah, that'd be
Uh,
helpful, yes.
that is my channel, so you can find me on YouTube at Reverend Ed Trevors or on Twitter at Rev Ed underscore 902.
There you go. Nice and simple to remember. So yeah, let's
That's it.
let's talk then about the Black Loyalists. So, as those who might remember from my Black Loyalist video, they came here in the wake of the American Revolutionary War. The idea was that the British promised freedom to any slaves who would rise up against their rebellious masters. And they actually ended up forming various units, which I think were called privateers, or like the Patriot Brigade or something like that. They had a name for them, and there were thousands of them in the wake of the American Revolutionary War. But as we all know, America won its War of Independence, and so there was still a bunch of now freed slaves who didn't want to go back into servitude, and so they fled with others, including slave owning British loyalists, to the various colonies of British North America, which we now know as Ontario and Quebec, but back then they were known as Upper Canada and Lower Canada. And we also had the colony of Nova Scotia, which eventually, because of the Loyalists and so many of them showing up, was broken off into two separate colonies, the colony of Nova Scotia and the colony of New Brunswick. And so I think that's where we should talk a bit about Shelburne and how some of this stuff comes to happen, because in the wake of this massive push, thousands of people, like upwards of 3,500 free Black Loyalists, end up settling in Nova Scotia, and nearly half of them go to your parish of Shelburne, Nova Scotia. Which, when you think about it, how many people are in Shelburne today,
Mhm.
Reverend?
About 1,600 in the town, and probably another 3,000 in the area surrounding in the municipality. So I mean,
Okay.
yeah, in the various areas surrounding us, there's probably, with the town included, it's probably like 4,000 people.
Okay, so comparatively, for back in the day, especially in the town and settlement proper, it's a comparable population in terms of how many people suddenly showed up to the region. But back before it had all the infrastructure and even more people and organization that it has today. And this is why, in the wake
What?
of the Loyalists arriving, Nova Scotia was known as Nova Scarcity. Is there anything in
Yeah,
Shelburne's history that touches on that?
yeah. So originally there was a settlement here in Shelburne called, I believe it's called Roseway, and it was fishermen and their families. And when the loyalists came, they were coming to a pre-established location. They were coming to a pre-established area, pre-settled area, and like in those first few months of those new settlers coming, like the numbers here exceeded 20,000 people within 6 months.
Wow.
Right. So at the end of the day, it wasn't like, we had 2,000 people here with low infrastructure. It was 20,000 people here with almost non-existent infrastructure. I mean, the people that were here before lived a very comfortable, very happy life. They lived within their means. They lived within what they had. And when those settlers came, 20,000 people drop on the area. And so the idea of scarcity, it did. I mean, just imagine throwing a Thanksgiving supper 600 people show up, right?
It'd be a little intimidating without proper planning and
Right,
organization.
right. And these were, the Loyalists coming to Nova Scotia. From my study of history, it wasn't that it was a great, huge planned emigration. It was, we lost the war, we got to go.
Yeah,
They were,
lots of people fled over land or by ship, pulling hand carts, or in other cases having their slaves carry their baggage, on their heads and on their backs as they're making their way through the forests and swamps of New England and upstate New York to land in the Canadian cities of Halifax, Shelburne, Quebec City, Montreal, Niagara on the Lake. Like this is where a lot of people fled to, and they, as you said, they had to do it
yeah,
in a hurry. So all of a sudden, the relatively remote northern colonies of British North America see a massive influx comparatively in their population practically overnight. It was over several years of the American Revolution. Oh, I don't want to be involved in war, so we're just gonna, well, we'll go to Halifax and we'll only have to be there for a while. Then we can return to Boston, and then it's, oh no, we're stuck here. So there was some of that, but
yeah.
still a massive increase. Which I guess means we should then talk about some of the promises of land that was made to the Loyalists. So,
Right. So
yeah,
loyal.
go ahead.
No, you please.
Okay. So again, I think I mentioned this just at the beginning of this, but the idea of freedom and a farm was the promise that the British made to freed Black Loyalists from the American Revolutionary War. And so in the wake of the war, they had their freedom. So they thought, okay, they made good on this part of the promise. So what about that land, freedom and a farm? And unfortunately, the Maritimes are predominantly very rocky places. It's a lot of forest and rock and granite and things like that. So farmland was very much a precious commodity, which is part of why the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia is so historic and full of conflict, because it was such a, lovely area for farming. That meant that a lot of the Black Loyalists who had been promised land were given less than ideal land. In fact, near Shelburne, a lot of the Free Black Loyalists, in fact, about half of them, actually went and settled in the Shelburne area, in an area across the harbor, which they called Birchtown. And you're probably more familiar with this area of Birchtown, so I'd love if you could tell people a bit more about this area, what it looks like, how it feels, if you can provide any insight.
Birchtown's a wonderful little area just outside of Shelburne. Great people, fantastic people. But the land is, it's basically a rock. It's carved out of a hill, and the land itself is difficult to farm. I've got friends that live in that area that today have massive gardens, and they have spent every year they still go through picking out rocks out of the soil. And when we're talking rocks, we're not talking tiny little rocks. We're not talking something the size of your hand. We're talking things that you couldn't fit onto the back of a dump truck. Like there's an area that we know as Hart's Point, and on Hart's Point, there's a little spot called the Quarry. And the Quarry is where much of the granite that was used all around Shelburne, and I want to say it was even shipped as far as Halifax to build buildings with. But it's a huge, big, massive stone complex, and this area is filled with those things. So when the Black Loyalists came and they said, "Okay, here's your piece of land," it wasn't the Annapolis Valley. It wasn't some of the rich soil you see in New Brunswick, or some of the farmland that you see in Prince Edward Island. It was 3 inches of dirt covering solid stone.
Yeah.
And they weren't, again, we talked about the scarcity. Well, there was scarcity in provisions, scarcity in tools, scarcity in equipment. And for what it's worth, those people that came, those freed black slaves that came here, they were at the back of the list, right? They were
Yeah.
as in
Because of
terms of the
racism.
government trying to provide for people, they were on the bottom of the list. They were at the back of the line. And yet it's a testament to their strength. It's a testament to their courage. It's a testament to their will, to their character, that they did dig homes out of this land, literally dug homes out of this land, and they made the best of the properties that was given to them, and day and night working. Right? It
Right.
really,
Which,
really.
yeah, that reminds me about working and what they did, because since farming was so untenable in a lot of these areas, uh, one of the things, I'm really glad you touched on how they just had to work and kind of find a way, for lack of a better term, because there's this fascinating little illustration that actually is from Shelburne, Nova Scotia, that shows the backside of a black woodcutter who's sawing apart this big log. And so that's something that I wish more people kind of were fascinated by and appreciate, because when we think of lumberjacks in Canada, we think of the big, burly, 6'5" man with a beard, and he's got a toque on and the red plaid with suspenders and the double bitted axe. But some of the earliest lumberjacks and woodcutters were the black Nova Scotians who were cutting down timber on their land and working with it and selling it either for use for the British in their ships or for, home building throughout the colonies. They found a way, even with being given the bottom of the barrel land grants, they found a way to be successful. It was hard, for sure, but they definitely found a way. And speaking of how difficult it was, I guess that's why we should talk about one of the more famous of the Black Loyalists who showed up and delve into his history, David George. Now, David George, I did touch on him a bit in my video, but you also found out some more fascinating information about David George and his history. He was, of course, born a slave in the United States, grew up as a Christian, was, I don't know if you would say converted or sort of reaffirmed in the Baptist faith. And he first started his own real mission or church, I think in what would become Washington, D.C., like somewhere in that area of what was then Maryland, was where he first got his start. Do you know anything more about that and some of his early life and his sort of faith-based history?
Well, from the faith perspective, one of the things to understand is that the Loyalists would mostly have been Church of England people, because of, obviously they're connected to the English crown.
Yep.
Their slaves were required to go to church. There are churches here in Nova Scotia, actually a couple that have been destroyed since, but when they were originally built, their balconies had areas set aside for the slaves to sit, and they actually had chain hooks and hoops in the walls for people to chain their slaves to.
That's messed up.
So faith was a very common thing for the Black Loyalists. That he would turn to the Baptist Church actually makes perfect sense. The Baptist Church is, the Anglican Church is an offshoot of the Roman Catholic Church that came about during the 1500s with Henry VIII. The Baptist Church is a church that was formulated out of the Anglican Church. Now, we won't get into all the different theology and stuff in that, but the Anglican Church at that time wouldn't have been a place that would be conducive to a person of African descent who is hearing God's call in their life to go and preach the word. We wouldn't have had an infrastructure that would have accepted a person of African descent to wear a collar, whereas the early Baptist Church, they would have been much more welcoming to that sort of thing. So the fact that he became a Baptist pastor is not surprising at all. That he created a church in a city like Washington, D.C. isn't surprising at all. to me, the surprising thing is that he chose to come here. He
Well,
would have had.
he sort of chose to come here upon getting his freedom, right? Like, if you have freedom, you're going to go where the freedom is guaranteed. This is part of why a lot of Canada's early black figures of significance, as I pointed out in my ongoing series about black history in Canada, it's always been tied in with the African American community because of the American Revolutionary War, slavery, the issues of fugitive slave patrols, and there's a whole bunch of videos. People are welcome to watch those, especially the one about Thornton Blackburn, where it solidified Canada as the terminus on the Underground Railroad. So it was more like he didn't really have a choice. Everyone was kind of coming out to Nova Scotia, and as a pastor, believing in black liberation and serving the black community, follow your flock, as it were, right? So that's what I guess probably led him here beyond his sort of first early starts, starting a church and a mission as a slave in the Americas. Then he gets his freedom and comes to Canada, which I guess means we should talk a bit more about some of his history while he's here in Canada. Do you want to take over that, or should I give people the...
Well, no, the thing I would say is, when I say here, I mean coming to a small, impoverished settlement in Nova Scotia. As you mentioned, Montreal was available, Toronto was available, York was, like, these other major centers were available. He's coming from a major center, and yet he chose to come here. And my suspicion would be it's because there was such a huge population of his people, people that he knew, people that he wanted to serve. And I think it's another one of those testaments to the character of these men and women that did come to Canada after being given their freedom. But as far as his history, I think, I thought your video on that was amazing. I thought your video on it was absolutely spectacular. Yeah.
Well, just to give people a quick overlay, he comes to Shelburne, Nova Scotia as a free man and starts preaching the word because, again, within the context, as we've discussed, about the sheer overwhelming of the colonial administration of Nova Scotia in the 1700s was just a terrible thing that they had to deal with, and black people were, again, thanks to racism and social hierarchies, at the very bottom of the list. So life was incredibly hard, but as many people will tell you, when life gets hard, it's usually when people turn to faith for strength, answers, a sense of purpose, belonging, community. And so I think that's part of what led to David George's success as a preacher, whether he would have been Baptist or otherwise. I think, if he had been Presbyterian, he probably would have been just as successful, because by being with his community and understanding their suffering and making parables of that from the Bible made him very successful, and lots of people were hearing what he was putting down, to the point that even other white settlers who were in Nova Scotia were beginning to follow and attend his sermons, which, again, in the 1700s would be unheard of in any other time. Like, even in the 1960s, to see like white people hanging out with black people or attending a Martin Luther King rally or speech or sermon would be seen as like, oh geez, you went to that, oh I don't know about you, like and this is in the 1700s. That's impressive that he managed to begin to bridge that gap, because the common point, which is again why I said he's probably kind of like an early Martin Luther King figure for the black Nova Scotians, was that the common point was the inherent unequal treatment of their people and advocating for, their own self-worth and dignity and respect, and also pointing out, that poverty was a making, that, look, the higher ups, they came here even with their slaves, talking about how there was actually plenty of land to go around, but people that treated Jesus and scorned him and pushed him away, that people were doing the same for the black people, which is why It was so important to still be good, be driven, help each other, because you got nothing else in this life at that point. And it was starting to resonate with a lot of people, that then the Baptist church was growing and growing, and word about him spread. And by, again, the late 1700s, he becomes the most famous pastor in the colony of Nova Scotia. And this is before, proper newspapers and telegrams. Like, yes, they had, newspapers to an extent, and not telegrams, but like courier post newsletters and things like that. These were a thing, but it took a while for things to get there, and it wasn't always in the best circulation. So the fact that he was known from Cape Breton to Shelburne and all areas in between is very impressive. But by doing that, he also ends up making some enemies. But before we get to that, I'd like to know perhaps your perspective as a man of the cloth. Like, you're literally wearing the color for us here in this video. What your thoughts are on this, and if you think that there's any sort of scripture that might have really resonated with him and the Black Nova Scotian community. I'd love to know your thoughts.
Well, there's a branch of theology called liberation theology. It sort of grew out of the 1960s in Central America in particular. People like Oscar Romero were huge proponents of it. And even to this day, even to this day, liberation theology is considered incredibly problematic by the powers that are in place, because what it speaks to isn't necessarily what it speaks to is that your inherent worth has nothing to do with the color of your skin. It has nothing to do with the language you speak, your nation of origin. It has nothing to do with your financial and economic abundance. Your self-worth, your actual worth must be seen through the eyes of God. And if you read the Bible, what you see is that God is continuously always on the side of the oppressed. And so if you look in the Bible, the Israelites in Egypt, when God comes, who does he come to help? He comes to help the slaves. Think about the Israelites as they've finally taken the promised land and they're living there and they're being attacked by others from outside. Whose side is God on? God's on the side of the oppressed. Whenever the prophets speak to the kings, they always speak to the kings about doing right for the people, doing right for the people. God calls us to love one another, and his message at that time, I haven't seen any of his sermons. That'd be amazing if there was any that I could find. But my suspicion would be he spoke to his congregation in such a way that he was continuously sharing with them God's love, that they were on God's side, that God valued them as much as God valued anybody of means and of wealth in the community that they were living in, because they would have seen just obscene wealth disparity at that time in this place. It would, today in Shelburne, you see it. There's the haves and the have-nots, like any other community in Canada. There are people that have money and there are people that have nothing. It would pale in comparison to what Black Loyalists would have experienced here in Shelburne in the 1780s. The difference between what they had and what the people of means in this community had would have been staggering. It would be much more like comparing what you and I have to what Bill Gates has, right?
It's
like a community of Bill Gates is a completely different reality. They live in a completely different reality. And as a person who's been enslaved, he would have been speaking a language that said, you matter, you are valuable, you are worthy, you are loved. And it has nothing to do with how much money's in your pocket. It has nothing to do with the quality of the land you were given. It has nothing to do with how much money you owe. And for that reason, when you start seeing those white loyalists start coming to him as well, they're coming for the same message, because that message is so incredibly universal. And the white folks that were here, those white loyalists that came, many of them were impoverished as well.
Mm-hmm.
And yet
Yep.
here was a message from a man saying, you're worthy, you're valuable, and welcoming them in.
Yeah, yeah. Like David George actually baptized white people, which is part of why,
Right.
unfortunately, he drew the ire of a lot of the racist social elites who were running the joint, saying, "Oh, we can't have any of this. This is against God's law," because unfortunately, the Bible can be interpreted in a variety of ways, many of them bad or deliberately leading
Yeah.
towards a place that enforces rigid rules and hierarchy. Which I guess also touches back on the idea that you brought up of liberation theology and how, really that shouldn't matter because you're trying to aspire for something beyond these sort of things. So that it's another thing that I wish some people were more aware of and thinking about. With that in mind, I guess we should talk about...
Well, you can let that bother you another day.
Yeah. So many days, so many things to be bothered by. Anyway, that's a great impression. So yeah, like
I don't have the hair for it.
You could always wear a wig. But one of the things that I do find most fascinating about David George in the limited research that I did to try and find out more about him before getting the video out was this real sense of purpose and drive. And I'm not a religious man myself, but I do respect when something is a driving force for people, whether it's, family, a goal, religion, whatever it is that sort of drives you towards good works and helping other people, I always very much respect. And seeing how he, helped lead his own community through very difficult and times full of poverty and scarcity is a testament to him and the community at large about the role that faith played for so many people. We are overall, as Western society, less and less religious. And many churches are closing down, and they're either being turned into, national historic sites if they're lucky, or museums, community centers. Less and less churches can actually fill their pews because people are turning away from religion for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons, like I'm happy to discuss with you probably in a video for another day, but in terms of at this point in time, everyone would go to church on Sunday, and usually at some other point during the week. Church was where you got married. It was also kind of like a community center. It would shelter people who didn't have homes, like, oh, our roof caved in on the farm. Can we shelter here for a few days while the rest of the community goes and rebuilds it? So they were very important centers of the community. And usually it was very much community focused. I know you had church organizations like parishes, dioceses in the Catholic Church and stuff like that. So I know that there's an organizational structure to it, but your parish, your flock is for Shelburne. Your parish is not the people of, say, St. John's, Newfoundland, right? So it was always about community, and yet he found a way to garner attention from around the colony. And while there's no real evidence for it that I could find, I think it's fairly safe to assume that his preaching and the preaching of other early Black Baptist ministers who fled the United States in the wake of the American Revolution, I suspect that that's a big part of why the Baptist Church is so popular among Black people, and especially in Nova Scotia, where there are several Baptist churches in Nova Scotia, and a lot of their patrons are Black Canadians. I think there's something about that church and that message about liberation and knowing that at the end of the day, God does love them in spite of all the struggles that they're facing. That's what they have to, deal with, but it gives them hope. It gives them strength. And unfortunately, though, when people start to get strength and when you start to bridge racial divides, like as we talked about with David George and, having white people attend his sermons because they could understand that message of, being downtrodden, not having enough to go around, struggling. And, like at the time, letting a willingly letting a black person touch you in the 1700s was incredible by those standards of the day. And yet he managed to do this for several other white loyalists in Nova Scotia, which unfortunately brings us to him raising the ire of racists in Nova Scotia. And unfortunately, this led to what would be called the Shelburne race riots, which I think were in 1788, I think.
1784, I believe.
Yes, okay, 1784. Which, yeah. I mean, and again, to give people a frame of reference, the American Revolutionary War, I'm pretty sure, didn't actually end until 1786. So this was an example of stuff that had been going on for years where people were leaving and trying to make lives in the rest of North America. But yeah, unfortunately, on the 26th of July, 1784, a mob of white people demolished not only George's home, but also the homes of several other Black Loyalists in Birchtown. They also attacked people with clubs and hooks, because again, woodworking, things like this, these were the tools that were available. And not only that, but it wasn't just a one-night affair. This went on for 10 days. And it's an unfortunate stain because this would become the earliest recorded race riot in North American history. Not Boston, not in somewhere where you might expect something like, Charleston or somewhere else in the South like Atlanta or, New Orleans or Jackson, Mississippi. It was in Shelburne, Nova Scotia. And it's a really unfortunate and dark stain on our history that people responded to a man preaching love and acceptance and unity, that they responded with violence. And in the wake of it, David George said himself that it might be best for himself and the community if he moved away. And so he did. And I think by this point, I forget if he moved back to America as a free man or if he moved somewhere else. I don't know. The details are a little murky, but he left Shelburne, Nova Scotia, which on the one hand I understand, but it's also very sad and troubling that he felt the need to do that to protect himself and of course his family, which, I get it, family comes first. I understand, but I also imagine that a lot of the people who had survived in Birchtown and trying to make a go of it and, daring to have the audacity to succeed and carve out a meager life for themselves were still punished for it. Do you have any thoughts or words to offer on that?
He gave people hope, right? And the one thing, if you look around our modern world, the one thing that a dictator, the one thing that a fascist ruler, the one thing that an oppressor will not allow their people to have is hope. And hope in the hands of the oppressed can raise the oppressed up. They'll do it themselves because they believe they're capable of it. They believe that the possibility is there. They believe that there's an opportunity for them. They believe that there's something else going on that they are a part of. And through his message, and then also if you add into that what was happening here from an economic perspective, you mentioned scarcity earlier. Mm-hmm. You still had those folks that were very, very rich. You had a great deal of people who were struggling day to day, who didn't have anything. Those people that did have, they were, for the most part, they were hiring incredibly cheap but hard-working Black Loyalists to come and do their work, and they were paying them absolutely pennies to do it.
Or they also used their slaves. I mean, slavery was still legal in the British colonies at this point in time.
Slavery was still legal in the British colonies as these time. And so you already have those relationships that are established between the landowners here and those in Birchtown. And what ends up happening is the people in the middle, they explode, right? They explode. So the race riots happen for a number of different reasons, none of them good. And all of them ultimately pointing to the fact that the white loyalists that were here had absolute disregard for people of color, an absolute disregard, a disrespect. They held those people of African descent, the people of indigenous descent in this area, to have no value whatsoever. They meant nothing. They were not human. They were the result of a promise that the king made in order to fight a war. Nothing more.
Yep. And in the end, they got
just
blamed for it.
Just because they carried what they called a birch certificate, which was their proof that they were free. That didn't mean anything. And it wasn't, you mentioned slavery still being illegal. It wasn't uncommon for Black Loyalists to go missing, being dragged back into slavery because either they didn't have their birch certificate with them or because the person that found them didn't care. And it would be shipped off to other places. So when the pastor decided it was time to leave, his flock would have been absolutely scattered, right? Those riots over those 10 days, it wasn't just, like as you mentioned, it wasn't just it happened one night and there was a fire and maybe a couple of people got beat up and it's a horrible thing.
It was a sustained effort to destroy a community. It
was a sustained, targeted effort to destroy a community. And for him, I suspect he took some of that responsibility. It's not responsibility. That is absolutely the wrong thing to say. He assumed blame that was not his.
I think that's fair. And again, I would also, point out that, here's basically two different groups of Christians, with one attacking the other group because of an economic hardship that they, the anger of the white loyalists in Nova Scotia who had fled there and were still being exploited by the rich.
Mm-hmm.
That is valid. Like, I get that. But then to target other people who are arguably struggling either at the same level of you or worse off, that's missing the point. That is focusing your anger on the wrong thing. And I think that's part of why David George was so successful early on, because he said, look, we're all suffering. I get it. It's bad. But, God still loves us. And the real issue are the people who have all the money. And that's probably when the higher up said, whoa, can't have any of this now. So don't you know the people in Birchland, that's why you don't have good jobs. And that's where all the lumber is going. And they're just making a killing. So you should go and deal with them or something like.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a fantastic picture of a man, and in front of him he has all these cookies, and there's another person sitting beside him who has one cookie, and there's an immigrant sitting across the table, and he says, that immigrant's trying to steal your cookie.
Yeah, it's like, well, can you not maybe, what if we all, if you have 15 cookies and there's 16 in total, maybe I don't know, you could keep 6 and then we can each get 5. That way you have one more than as you have more cookies, but we also have lots of cookies, and then we can share those cookies with other people. But what do I know? I'm just a filthy socialist. Anyway, it is an unfortunate part of not just Nova Scotian history, but Canadian history as a whole. But I think it's important to bring awareness to it because of the message of love and the struggle is real. These are messages that still resonate with people to this day, whether they're religious or not, in my opinion. And it also shows that the ruling class, wherever they may be, are always threatened by people coming together. there's definitely some lessons here from the Shelburne race riots and the story of the not just Black Loyalists, but the Loyalists in general, in terms of coming in, finding scarcity, trying to make a go of it, but then having that pressure. It really, to me anyway, like, feel free to disagree, but to me, it feels like that's a great lesson for why actually providing for people ultimately results in more good than harm. If the rich had been forced to pay a bit more and share more of the land and actually give promised land to the black people, when they found out they were struggling, we'll find out why. Oh, it's because of slavery. Well, then we should get rid of slavery and people should actually have wages. And, yeah, sure, the Black Loyalists, fine, they don't have the great land, but okay, you can have the woodcutting business and like lumber yards and shipbuilding. We'll do farming and like cattle rearing, and we'll do leather tanning and stuff like that. Like, but there easily could have been a better world without racism and inequality, and with people hoarding all the good land and all the good resources because they had proper patronages for the king. New Brunswick was named after like the Prince or the Duke of Brunswick. Prince Edward Island was named for Prince Edward. Before that, I think it was called like Queen Anne's Island or something like that. Like, it's always just been named for some monarch, and there's patronage appointments, and it's such an endemic part of Canadian history that we don't pay enough attention to.
Yeah. I honestly, I just did a video on Revelation. I did it this morning, and I'll be releasing it Monday, maybe Sunday.
Okay.
But it's Revelation's that terrifying book at the back of the Bible. But the truth is, I don't think, if you look at the Bible, if you look at these stories we see through history, what we don't see a story that has a beginning and an end. We see a cycle. It's a continuous cycle throughout history. Mm-hmm. Everywhere, every era, every century, we see the same cycle. And for some reason, our brilliant brains that can, put a car on Mars, we can't figure it out that a living wage would save so much trouble, right?
Well, not just a living wage, also just proper support structures. Oh, people are unhoused, provide them housing. People are struggling, get that community in action and helping support them with food, clothes, toys.
You made mention of a gentleman in Toronto. He's building small houses for people so they don't freeze to death. Well, we better get rid of that guy, throw him in jail as soon as we can. If we just came to the realization that this cycle that we're in, whatever phase of the cycle we happen to find ourselves, whatever phase of the process we happen to find ourselves in, if we can get off this, we can get off this ride, right? Nothing's going to fix it. We can get off this ride. And if we choose to get off this ride, we can avoid these things like that we've seen all through history, like the race riots. Like slavery, like endemic poverty, systemic racism, colonialism. These things aren't accidents. They're not accidents.
There's that famous saying that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Right.
And it's kind of how it feels these days. And as you said, looking throughout history and just seeing the cycle constantly repeat itself. And we somehow think, oh, no, this time it'll be different and better because we've made progress or we have new technology. And it's the same story.
I mean, here in Shelburne, we still have a very large percent of our population that would draw their lineage back to the Black Loyalists. And over the years, we've seen a lot of interracial marriage, and so we see these beautiful families that are together. And when they gather, there's people of there are white people, there are people of African descent, there are indigenous people. It's really beautiful. And I'd love to say that we've learned our lesson. We've become a utopia. The truth is, during times of scarcity here, you see that cycle come running back again. Oh, it's because somebody took something from us. Oh, it's because the indigenous people took something from us. Oh, it's because the Black Loyalists are getting something that we didn't get. Oh, it's because of this. Oh, it's because of that.
Case in point, the whole lobster issue that was happening in Nova Scotia recently, and I think might still be going on. I know the RCMP have laid some charges, but that was a whole ordeal that happened, and I'm sitting here like, it's literally in their treaty rights, and in exchange for them being able to do that and earn that moderate livelihood, you're allowed to live in Nova Scotia as a white person. Like, that was literally the treaty. You can live on our land, settle it, farm it, etc. In exchange, we get to hunt whenever we want. Like,
right.
That's,
I to offer probably a too simplistic look on it, perspective on it. The lobster industry last year, because of COVID-19, took a huge beating. One of the number one clients, one of the buyers, is China. China stopped all importing at one point, so they weren't accepting lobster to come in during our season, which runs from December through May. They weren't buying near as much as they used to. People weren't going out to restaurants. The lobster industry here really suffered. So at the beginning of the next season, what do we see? We see this happen, and everybody's nerves are up, everybody's anxieties are up. Yep. We don't know what kind of season we're going to have this year. And here you're fishing, and you're fishing early. Well, we're going to blame you. The truth, as far as I see it, the government was given the federal government of Canada giving 25 years to sit down with the parties involved and figure out what exactly does moderate living mean. Mm-hmm. 25 years, and they hadn't done it.
Because unfortunately, we don't care. That's the issue.
They don't care. It's never going to be an election issue for people that look like me, right? For the most part. It's not going to be an election. Oh, you're not going to take care of the indigenous rights? Oh, whatever, right? That's not going to be something I'm going to, people that look like me worry about. Most people have their own worries. This probably isn't. But anyway, this is all opinion as far as from my perspective, but it's the same cycle. It's the same cycle repeating itself.
Yep. And those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it is another phrase that's coming to mind with regards to the story of the Black Loyalists and, of course, David George and his ministry and his preaching.
I'm going to ask you a question, though. Why is it that when people utter those statements, we say it about war, right? We say it about oncoming fascism. We say it against tyranny. We say it against dictatorship, but we don't apply economic history.
Oh, I personally absolutely do. But yes, I know that there's lots of people who don't.
But the people that use that phrase against me, if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it. All right. Let's talk about the Great Depression, the Great Recession, the Great Depression then. Let's talk about that. Do we not see how that cycle is rolling back around through?
Unfortunately, yes. And it's a sign that, like what happened after the Great Depression, we're going to need a series of new policies, perhaps a new deal to help alleviate and change things, given the changing nature of the workforce, which is what was also happening in the 1920s.
Imagine, what would that look like?
I
read something about that.
I really don't know. I wonder if anyone's talked about that.
I'm almost green with envy over that kind of thing.
Yeah, geez, it just really makes one wonder what maybe a kind of Green New Deal or something. I don't know if anyone's talked about that.
I don't know.
But with that, I know we've talked about, for something like this, I do try and sort of bring it back to a nicer, not exactly more wholesome, but still like a nice, good place. We talked about how, this sort of this fascinating history, but then it gets really dark and terrifying. So I want to bring it back to the good place, as it were, which was that this still offers lessons and hope for us in the present day. Yeah. And if we take heed of not just the Black Loyalist story and David George's story, but also apply the context of that to the modern day, when we see people talking about how a better, greener world is possible. A fairer, more equitable world for workers is possible. Let's not dismiss that out of hand, because this has been a constant struggle that people have been fighting towards. And if you look at the broad progress from the 1700s till now, we've made quite a few gains. We still have a lot of work to do, but it's important work that needs to be done. So I do want people to come away from this, heeding the warnings, but also seeing hope for the future, their communities, and ways of moving forward with it, whether it's religion or just wanting a better world because you understand that the world is all we've got. Whatever it is that drives people, I want people to remember that it is possible. You just need to remember your why, remember what drives you. So with that, do you have any other last words to say to people? It could be scripture based or not. I yield the floor to you, Reverend.
Well, let me tell you about Jesus. Really, there's lots of scripture that applies to this, and we can get into that. But the truth is, I think for this conversation, given what it is, I think it's important to remember the Black Loyalists, to remember the character that they displayed. After the riots, there was no revenge. They didn't come trying to burn others' houses down. They came back to work. They did their thing. They still worked hard on their farms. They still worked hard for their families. They still worked to carve a life out for themselves. And that expression, to carve a life out for yourself, I don't know. I'd be interested to find out where that originated from, because it could possibly be right here in Shelburne. Because when the Black Loyalists did arrive, they literally carved their houses into the ground. They dug holes in the ground and put an A-frame up over it to keep themselves warm and as dry as possible. They did everything they could to provide for their family. And that's such a great lesson for all of us, right? Even though they went without, even though they had nothing, it didn't stop them. It didn't stop them. So when we look at our future, and we despair about our future, we're worried about it, we're afraid for it. We don't know if things will change. We desperately want things to change, but it just seems like it seems like we keep hearing the same things over and over and over again. And every time we take a step back, it seems like we take 2 steps. Every time we take a step forward, it seems like we take 2 steps back. We just got to keep going. We just got to keep persevering. That's who we've been made. We are made by our Creator to keep pushing forward, to keep trying to bring the kingdom of God forward into this world, to bring equality. That's our job, right? To bring equality, to bring abundance to people's lives, and to help people thrive where they are, regardless of money. That's our job as humanity. And so we just gotta keep pushing forward. We just gotta keep moving. Yeah.
Keep moving, keep fighting. Don't lose hope. I think
I'm hesitant to say it that way. I am hesitant to say it. We gotta keep fighting, because somebody ruined that line for us.
That's true. But I'd say the rest is still a very good, hopeful message to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you.
I mean, despite the race riots here in Shelburne, and despite the tarnish that it leaves on us, it didn't destroy the people of Shelburne. They continued to grow. It didn't destroy the people of Birchtown. They continued to grow. They continued to come together. To this day, they continue to come together. When we do have moments where racism rears its nasty, ugly, cowardice head, you see a community that within seconds gels and works to put that sort of thing down. So the spirit that Pastor George left here, it's still relevant. It's still meaningful to us here. The people are a people of perseverance and of character.
Yeah, it also that the idea of community also touches on something that I know a lot of people are talking about today, whether on the left and the right, is the importance of community, looking out for one another. Which, I mean, then when I see people doing things that are against the interests of the community, but again, I digress. But the idea of community being important, still keeping hope, working towards progress, these are all very good things. So I hope that people come away from this, despite learning about a terrifying and bloody part of our history, that they still come away with a sense of perseverance and hope, and that the fight or the march towards progress is a long and eternal struggle, if we're using the F word in this context. So I hope people come away with something good from this. And I thank you so much for taking time out of your weekend for joining me today. Do you want to once again plug your socials for people and let them know about your YouTube channel and your Twitter?
All right, I'll try to do it better this time. So you can find me on Twitter at Reverend Ed _902. You can find me on Facebook as Ed Trevors. You can you can see our churches group at Christ Church News and Happenings, and you can find me on YouTube at Rev Ed Trevors. And thank you so much for this opportunity. I love the stuff that you're doing. I really do. Keep doing it, and I'd love to have another conversation with you again sometime. Maybe we could talk more about economics next time.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about a lot of things with people. We can talk about economics. We can talk more about theology and faith and what drives people. We can talk about like more history. We can talk about like various different topics that are just not coming to mind because I haven't had my coffee yet. In fact, I'm not allowed coffee for the duration of Lent. That's what I've given up.
What?
Yes, I've given up coffee for Lent.
You are in the wilderness, my son.
Well, you know what? It is what it is. It's a testament because who knows? Maybe in the future we may not be able to have coffee anymore. So I'm just trying it out. But again, thank you so much for not only your kind words, but offering extra bits of history and perspective on this, especially as someone from the area where all this happened. I thank you so much. And I thank everyone who's watching this video. Please go follow Reverend Ed. Like he said, he's on Facebook, he's on Twitter, he's on YouTube. Go and find him. I hope you enjoy his content. And until next time, Reverend.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.